actual introduction to the video. I'm so super excited about this sourdough loaf. I don't know if you're like me, but over the years I have looked at recipes online for sourdough bread starters, and I thought, oh goodness, this is way too much trouble. So I pretty much put together a bunch of stuff last week and started working on my own starter recipe. It is quite different than a normal starter. One, it doesn't start with yeast, and some of them don't, some of them do. The big difference in mine is that I'm actually starting with a very small amount of flour and some pineapple juice, as I'll tell you in the video, and then I'm only adding 2 tablespoons of flour and 2 tablespoons of water a day, instead of having to discard half of the portion like they do when they start with a cup of starter. So this is going to cultivate a wild yeast, so you're able to get the sourdough without having the waste, and also able to monitor it a little better. The only downside of this is today I was able, after 5 days, to make this 1 loaf of sourdough bread, but I've already put back the amount of flour and water that I've taken out, and I actually have enough starter by tomorrow. After it sits for 24 hours, it's already getting bubbly. I'll have enough to do a loaf of sourdough bread every day if I want to that way. If you don't want to continue to work with the sourdough and you just want to give it a break, you can just sit it in the fridge and you don't have to feed it for a week, just once a week, usually on the same day. But if you want to use it, you just keep it out on the counter. Let's say I want to make one of these every day. I'll take out the mixture needed for the recipe, and then I'll put equal amounts of flour and water back in. The other thing is, if you're looking up sourdough recipes, everyone does them by weight, which I find very frustrating, and I just did it the old-fashioned way, just tablespoon at a time, and it seemed to work fine. Sourdough bread has as many variations and ways to be made as there are people almost. So this is something you adapt yourself, and this is a really great recipe. And when you think that this starts out as a little ball of dough and then creates this beautiful loaf that's really crusty, and it has this beautiful airy texture, which this one is the one that you'll see at the end of the video. But anyway, the starter can be left out on the counter. If your house is really warm in the summertime, you might want to find a cool spot, maybe in a cabinet for it, but it likes about 70 to 80 degrees. And put it in a glass jar in a container. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and the recipe will be in the description below. Hey guys, so today I'm going to show you how to make a sourdough starter without using any yeast. You can make sourdough starters where you begin with a little bit of yeast in your flour, but we're actually going to do the more traditional style of sourdough bread, which is actually to capture wild yeast that is just in our environment in your home. And so I'm actually going to stir this up, and this is a process that takes about 3 to 5 days to complete the starter so that you can make the bread. So this is going to be the step 1, and then every day after that I'm going to tell you what to do, and then you'll be ready to make the bread. So I've actually ground some spelt flour. You can use any kind of freshly milled flour. You can also use all-purpose flour if you have hard red, hard white, rye, a lot of different grains. You can do a mix, but I'm just going to start with what I had, which was 3 tablespoons. I can get them in my cup here, or in my jar. And you want to do this in a glass container. It just works better. And I'm actually going to do 2 tablespoons of unsweetened pineapple juice. Now, a lot of starters will begin with just water, but I'm going to use the juice because it gives the yeast just a little bit of a boost as far as working into the flour, and it helps give a jump start to your starter. So, and that is it. We're going to mix this up. Just make sure you get everything nice and wet. Give it a good stir. And then I'm actually just going to not screw the lid down. I'm just going to put a lid loosely on this, and I'm just going to sit it over here on the counter. It doesn't have to be in a really warm place, just room temperature is fine. And sometime throughout the day, when I look at it, when I'm working in the kitchen, I'm just going to give it a stir a couple of times just to create some oxygen and air bubbles in there so that the yeast has plenty to work with. And then the next day, I will actually add 2 tablespoons of flour and 2 tablespoons of water. No more juice, just 2 tablespoons of flour, 2 tablespoons of water, and I will add that to this for 3 to 5 days until the mixture becomes very active and bubbly. So it's really very simple. Sourdough can be very complicated. It is an art form, and everyone's home environment, everyone's yeast culture that they will start with is very different. So it's kind of unique to your bread recipe. But we're going to get our starter going, and then we're going to show you how to use it in the bread. Okay, so I'm going to get Katie to zoom in here. This is the starter. Mine's been going about 5 days, so today's the 5th day on that. You can see how liquidy but also fluffy it is, and it smells really good. It has that signature sourdough smell to it. So I'm going to use 3/4 a cup of this. I'm going to go ahead and put this into my measuring cup, and that's going to leave me some. So here's the part where it's not really confusing, but that leaves me pretty much what I'm starting with on the first day in there. And I'm actually going to add back the same amount of liquid and flour that I've taken out. So I want to end up with probably, I'm going to put in 6 tablespoons of flour and 6 tablespoons of water, which will get this started again. And then I can just sit it on my counter and stir it every day. And I can keep feeding that if I want to make more starter. So anyway, there's that part. And now we're going to start the bread. Now we don't use any instant yeast or any packets of yeast because this is our wild yeast starter, so that's going to be the only leavening that the bread has. And that's why this bread takes a little bit of time. Not a lot of hands-on time, but some time to rise throughout the day, because when you've cultivated your own yeast, it is a slower process than any of the single strains that you get in the packets. So I have 1 1/4 cups of very warm water. I'm doing this in a Bosch mixer today. You can do it by hand, you just have to knead it a few more minutes. 1 1/2 teaspoons of salt, 1 tablespoon of honey. There isn't any oil in this recipe, so I have the 3/4 a cup of my starter here, so I want to try and make sure I get all that out. I want all that goodness that we worked for to get in there. When you buy yeast at the store, it is only made from a single strain. When you capture your own yeast like this with the sourdough, you're actually getting many, many different strains of yeast, so it makes the flavors of the bread much more in depth. And then I have 3 cups of fresh flour. This just came out of my grain mill, so it's still really warm. So that makes for a really good starter there. And then that is actually all I'm going to do, and I'm just going to turn the mixer on. If you're doing this in a bowl, you can just do it by hand with a wooden spoon, and you're just going to incorporate the ingredients briefly, get them all wet, and then this is going to sit for 15 minutes. Okay, so I have let this sit for actually 20 minutes, and just basically this is like a proofing time. I don't have all the flour in there that I'm going to have, but it was the bulk of the flour. And so there's a lot of little air bubbles in here, and it actually smells really fermenty and good like sourdough already. So I'm actually just gonna incorporate some more flour. Now when you're making sourdough bread with freshly milled flour, it is a whole different ball game than when you're using white flour. So keep that in mind, that there is the 3 cups of flour I put in here, but as far as measuring, it's totally gonna go by the look of the dough. So I'm going to incorporate a little more flour until the dough looks right, and I'll let you see that in the bowl. And then I'm going to transfer it into this bowl, and we're going to let that sit for 2 hours. And during that time, I'm going to just fold the bread every 30 minutes. When I look at it, I'm just going to go over there and kind of give it a fold and a turn, and that's what helps develop the carbon dioxide, which is going to help the bread to raise, as well as release the gas that's in there from the rise. And then it's also going to give it the nice airy texture when you cut it, so you're incorporating the air. And also keeping the dough temperature so that you don't have hot spots in the bread. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this on. I'll put my lid on. Turn this on 1. If you're doing this in a bowl or by hand, of course you're just going to mix it in your bowl with your spoon. Starting with a 1/2 cup of flour here. It's kind of a damp day where I'm at, so dough out. It has kneaded for 5 minutes in the mixer, or if you're doing it by hand, you would have kneaded it for probably 10 minutes. And so you can tell that it's just a little different than a normal bread. We've got more stretchy texture here, but it is still able to hold together. So I'm actually just going to put this into a bowl that I'm going to sit on the counter, and I'm going to leave it there for 2 hours. About every 30 minutes while I'm doing other stuff in the house, I'm going to come over though and just fold this. I'm going to fold the dough and push it down just to incorporate, like I said, the mixing of the temperature and make sure that everything stays even. You do not want to cover this tightly. You just want to leave it like that on the countertop for about 2 hours, and then we'll come back. Okay, so we have the dough that's been sitting for a couple hours, and every 30 minutes or so, I just came over and gave it a fold like that. So I'm actually just gonna get it out on the counter, and then again, it's supposed to be sticky like this. You don't want it too dry or it won't develop the proper crust and everything. So we're just gonna get it out of its bowl, give it a few turns because we're trying to incorporate some air in this and also help the carbon dioxide to release, which is what gives us that nice airy texture and the crumb crust on the outside. That makes sourdough bread worth the extra trouble. So we're just going to give it a few turns. My job here is not to try to knead the bread. It's basically just to incorporate the air back into it. And then I'm actually going to put it back in the bowl into his little home here. And I'm going to leave it for 3 hours. And I might come back every 30 to 45 minutes and just give it a quick turn. But it can actually sit here and rest. If you forget about it, it's no big deal. And then we will do our final rise time and our last step when I get back. Okay, so the dough is finally ready to be shaped, and we're going to finish this last step up. And so if you can see here, the dough is still a little bit wet, but I can handle it. It's not touching, it's not sticking to my hands. So I'm just gonna actually put him out on the counter here. I've got a little bit of flour to the side, just a little bit the extra flour I had ground, because you do wanna be able to work this, and it is kind of sticky as you can see, so I just get all of this off. This is beautiful, especially considering there's no store-bought yeast in this at all, and it is rising just like it should. So I'm gonna just give it a good fold here. We're not trying to knead it again, or just trying to incorporate enough flour. You do want to have some flour on the top part, because when we make our cut with a knife before we bake the bread, the flour being on it helps. So we just have our really pliable disc here. Oh, it smells so good. And I'm going to transfer this to some parchment paper. It's kind of in the shape that I want it in. And now this is the part that I have like a cast iron enamel Dutch oven here. You can do this in just a seasoned cast iron Dutch oven as well. And I have my oven on 450 degrees. I just turned it on. And I'm going to place this Dutch oven into the oven that's going to heat for 40 minutes. And during that time, that's going to be when this bread will do its final rise. So I'm going to leave this here. I'm going to cover it with a little towel, and we're going to put this in the oven for 40 minutes, and then I'm going to transfer it in there to bake. Okay, so I have gotten out the Dutch oven. So it's been in a 450 degree oven for 40 minutes while this sourdough bread has been doing its final rise. So I'm going to take the lid off now, and I'm going to transfer this parchment paper and all into the container, and put the lid on it, put it back in the 450 degree oven for 15 minutes with the lid on, and then I'll take the lid off and finish baking it for another 10. Actually going to make 3 little cuts in it too as well. Just a few little slashes to give it that sourdough artisan look. Just however you want to there. Okay. It's ready to go. So loaf. I'm so excited because it's always exciting. They're beautiful. And to think that this was created with wild yeast that you were able to cultivate in your own kitchen. And so if they're out of yeast at the grocery store, it doesn't matter because you can make your own. So I'm going to just lift this up with the parchment paper here. That is still really hot. We're going to take him off. And if you hear that hollow sound and the crusty crust, and then inside, when it's cool enough to cut, I'll show you what it looks like, and it gives it that signature airy sourdough texture inside and this crispy crust on the outside, and you really just can't get this without a true sourdough recipe. Okay, so I think it's cool enough that I can cut it. We're going to have this for dinner tonight, but I wanted to show you guys what it looks like. So if you can hear that good sound, that means that that is sourdough bread. You want to hear that crusty sound when you're cutting through. It's totally different than the sound of the soft bread. And then if you can see, it's still really hot. The air holes will actually show better when it's a little cooler, but you have this crust on it and then this delicious texture inside of it. So if you see there, if I tear that away, that's just like really good texture. And that only happens when you're using fresh yeast that you cultivate yourself. If you guys decide to make this recipe, let me know what you thought about it in the comments below, and please subscribe to my channel. Thank you.